Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Stephen McLeod, and I'm the Director of Library Programs here at Washington Presidential Library. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Ford Evening Book Talk. And before we get started, we also always want to take a moment and thank Ford, our generous donor that has been a great friend of Mount Vernon for many, many years, and also has underwritten this series that allows us to offer really wonderful educational programming once a month at no cost to the public. And before we get started, I also want to remind you of some upcoming events that we've got. On October 8th, we're going to be having our Supreme Court Lecture Series. This is a two-part event, the first part having already taken place at the Supreme Court, but this part of the series will be taking place at Mount Vernon, and it's a discussion on the history of the Supreme Court, particularly as it relates to politics. And then our next Ford Evening Book Talk is going to be taking place on November 13th. And that's going to feature historians David Head and Timothy Hemis. And they are the editors of a new book called A Republic of Scoundrels, the schemers, intriguers, and adventurers who created the new American nation. And then our next lunch at the library is going to be on October 17. That's a really special day in the history of Mount Vernon. That's the 200th anniversary of the day that Lafayette visited here on his return visit to the United States. And we're actually going to be doing a program here in the library that includes lunch. And it's a local author, Elizabeth Reese, is going to discuss her new book, Marquis de Lafayette Returns, a tour of America's national capital region. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Michael Hattem is an associate director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, and he teaches online graduate courses for Eastern Washington University. He earned his PhD in history from Yale. He published his first book in 2020, The Past is Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. And we have copies of that first book out here for sale, as well as his current book that he's going to be talking about tonight. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Smithsonian Magazine, and the Washington Post. He's been a two-time member of the Washington Library's class of fellows. He was here in 2014-15 and again in 2017 and 2018. He joins us tonight to discuss his new book, The Memory of 76, which you see here on the screen, The Revolution in American History. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Hattem.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to begin with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine, around the turn of the 19th century. In January of 1800, having been moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg, a former Continental Army officer who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the Revolutionary hero. Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name. But then she went a step further. Had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still, but this I suppose impracticable. Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, who was the Washington's personal secretary, in which he wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair which I have now the honor to enclose." Shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail, and inside were two envelopes, one marked "Read this first." In that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington." Then he wrote, "I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." And then Eliza described what happened next. She wrote, "I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. Now imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe, that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor the relic?" she wrote. "I feel as if it was too great for me to possess. I want to give thousands who have never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy. But Eliza's health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister Zilpa. I wish it may be preserved in our own family while it can be safe. Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the Revolution that Americans began to forge in the early 19th century, particularly as they realized that the revolutionary generation was beginning to disappear. And that emotional connection has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I want to begin my talk tonight by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years, which I think both historians and citizens have taken for granted. And I think that more deeply understanding that relationship has a lot to tell us about the past, the present, and the future as we continue barreling our way toward the 250th anniversary of independence. The memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin or foundation myth, is a story that explains how something came to be. And through telling that story, it defines the character and principles of that typically society, and also expresses a vision of the future. And so to talk about mythologizing the revolution is not merely to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but is to tell the story of the revolution, to explain how the United States came to be, to define the American character, and to set the agenda for the nation's future. And so I want to explore what it actually means that we have mythologized the revolution, how that has worked, and what it tells us about Americans' relationship to their founding. Myths are first and foremost stories, and like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act focuses on the coming of the revolution, and this typically features a succession of legislation and events: the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. The second act features the war and is structured around a timeline of major battles: Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. And the third and final act recounts how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And so it has a sort of logical beginning, middle, and end. And this traditional story structure has imbued the telling of the revolution with a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology, first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. Put simply, it's a sort of sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and others. And I want to suggest that how Americans have told the story of the American Revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. At the start, the hero, or in our case, heroes, revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. After a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over the colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Tea Party, And this attack on colonial self-government causes colonists to create a Continental Congress. And in the stories, typically the hero initially resists the call to adventure. Throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence and instead focuses on trying to reconcile with Britain. Eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. In July 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then undergoes a series of trials and temptations. For the revolution, these trials are represented by many of the war's battles. Though rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories feature in their retelling mythical themes and near mythological scenarios, such as the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn. So the story goes that penned in along the East River by the British Army, Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under cover of darkness and thanks to an opportune fog, right? Similarly, there is the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 76, mythically depicted in Emanuel Letz's famous 1851 painting, when Washington crosses the Delaware River with his ragtag army at night and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians days before the army's enlistments are about to end. Such tales have lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution in our popular memory. Though these stories are rooted in actual historical events, they have been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, including telling them as though they represented direct interventions by God, which lends them a sort of predestined or even providential nature to the origin myth. Often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. For the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround General Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible, effectively ending the war and securing independence. As a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. In our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states, but as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, you guessed it, the Constitution, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better, thanks to the hero having undertaken their adventure and the illuminating revelations or first principles that they bring back with them. Now, because of its prevalence and longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us without being explicit. The mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West have essentially sort of culturally hardwired us so in a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses. And that the story of the revolution has often been told like this, I think helps us better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. Because these stories kindle intense emotional connections, in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. After all, Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger-than-life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seeming providential victory against all odds over the world's most powerful evil empire. Right? And there's a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. Many generations of Americans, I think especially in the 19th century, who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. This mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic, mythical past replete with heroes and villains and peril and daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. Throughout, there is a sense that good and evil exist, that they're clearly delineated, and that the former always triumphs over the latter. It's a myth of a beginning of a new age. And by casting Americans as both its heralds and its heirs, the nature of the popular memory of the revolution has lent a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. And this is in no small part why the revolution has been so central to our politics, culture, and national identity for nearly 250 years. And I think that understanding the form in which the story has been told helps us understand that emotional connection to our origin story. But there is actually a field of study known as fandom studies that explores how people and groups relate to such stories and other facets of popular culture, and how they express their emotional connections to these stories, and even more how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that these fan cultures do this is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. And Americans do the same for the revolution every July 4th, every time they visit places like Mount Vernon or Independence Hall or the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way they express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in cosplay, right? Where fans dress up in full costume of their favorite characters. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. We also see this in our political culture if we think about the Tea Party in the 2010s. Another way these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter. And Americans have done this by creating and reading historical fiction. That is, stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real-life characters. And one of the most popular of these, at least in the 20th century, was Johnny Tremaine. A fourth way that fans engage with the stories that they have connections to is through fan art. Or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes or characters from their stories. And we can think of Trumbull and Lutz as fan art of the American Revolution. And a final way I'll mention is that fans visit recreations of the world of their stories. So fans of Harry Potter can visit Universal Studios theme park and walk down Diagon Alley. Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the set of the Shire. And, you know, this is the same reason why Americans visit Colonial Williamsburg, right? Or the Boston Freedom Trail. They want to inhabit the stories that they love and the characters that they have a connection to because it strengthens their connection to them and to the community of fans. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have similarities to these fan cultures, which are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish such a deep emotional connection to these stories that they go on to form part of their personal identity and make them part of a shared community. After all, nations are in no small part held together by the stories that they tell about themselves and their origins. In that sense, nations are as much a literary creation as they are a political creation. Now, this is not to argue that nationalism is a form of civic fandom, but I think that the similarities suggest something even more elemental about how we relate to mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us the power of the memory of the revolution comes in no small part because it's an origin myth told in the form of a hero myth. And this has contributed to Americans developing a unique emotional connection to the memory of the revolution. Now, there is another origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination that goes back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And I think helps us understand not just Americans' connection to the memory of the revolution, but also their use of it. In the 18th century, many British subjects believed that history was cyclical rather than linear. That is, empires and civilizations sort of rose when their people had a collective hunger for political power and economic prosperity, and then once they achieved those things, they would sort of lose the virtues that helped them gain that, and then eventually those societies or empires would inevitably fall. And believing that this cycle had played out across history, British thinkers in the early 18th century argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote-unquote first principles. For them and for British colonists in North America, that meant the principles of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in their own revolution. And I would argue that the conflicts that we have had over the meaning and legacy of the founding for the last 250 years have been in no small part about choosing, defining, and justifying the most important first principles of the revolution. If we take liberty, for example, Americans have never agreed on the definition of liberty. Is the liberty mentioned in the Declaration that of the individual? Is it of the society as a whole? Are some liberties deserved by some citizens but not others? Which ones and why? If we think about the idea of equality, is the equality mentioned in the Declaration equality before the law? Is it racial equality? Is it economic equality, equality of opportunity? So as I show in my book, Americans' answers to these questions have changed over time, and there have been multiple conflicting answers to these questions at any given time. And so this idea of returning to first principles to forestall an inevitable decline suggests that there's some kind of protection in looking back to the past. And whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have not just inherited, but intensified this notion that there is a sense of protection that comes from looking back to our founding. And this too helps explain our unusual emotional connection to the revolution. But what Americans over the last quarter of a century have done with that emotional connection, what first principles they found in the revolution and used the revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. So even within the general structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story, certain people, to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. And that's what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling or interpreting a story about the past to attribute specific meanings to it. As my book shows, Americans have interpreted the revolution and its meaning in many different and directly conflicting ways. And most of them, even the ones that directly contradict one another, are typically rooted in the actual history of the revolution. But none of them on their own are the whole truth, because the revolution was too rich and complex an event to ever be distilled into a single story or narrative or to have one meaning. After all, the founding generation itself never agreed on what the revolution meant or what its first principles were. In other words, there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. As a national origin myth, that complexity has allowed the popular memory of the revolution to constantly be contested and adapted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to it reflect our own times and are typically intended to justify our previously held beliefs. And so how we talk about the revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, and far more about us than the revolution. In this book, I argue that the memory of the revolution has essentially provided a shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. So let me give you an example of that. If we go to the early to mid-19th century, for much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the unity of the new states. For that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. But that began to change in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence, which defined the Declaration by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mentioned the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831, which is one of the most important abolitionist newspapers of the era. Introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston when he writes, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." Then he continued, "Assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population." Abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, "the fundamental document of our national existence." In other words, abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the Revolution by the Declaration. That, however, did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, "all men are created equal," as, quote, "a rhetorical flourish," and claimed that upon this proposition, false as it is, rest the wild theories of liberty held by so many. In the hands of the abolitionists, Southerners claimed the Declaration had become, quote, "a very seditious instrument." For them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the Revolution, not the Declaration. After all, the Constitution had been Southerners' best tool for protecting slavery through repeated compromises over new states being admitted to the Union, to maintain the congressional balance between slave and free states, and later the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott case. In the 1840s, Garrison and his followers also began to see the Constitution as the greatest impediment to abolition. And that notion was stoked by the first publication of James Madison's Notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1841. Until then, Americans had known very little about what had happened in the convention. But now they could read the debates over representation and the compromises that had been made to appease the slave states. In 1844, Wendell Phillips published a compilation of these portions of the notes that dealt with slavery in a book called The Constitution, a Pro-Slavery Compact, that he claimed showed, quote, "most clearly the details of that compromise which was made between freedom and slavery in 1787. And the main audience he's targeting here were abolitionists who had long argued that the revolution and the revolutionaries, including slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson, had been fundamentally anti-slavery. For Garrison and Phillips and their followers, the Constitution was corrupted from the start because of this compromise. As a result, the Garrisonians began to call for disunion because slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises to benefit slaveholders. Not all abolitionists agreed. In his famous speech on July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass, a former ally of Garrison, said, "I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution. It is a slander upon their memory, and interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." This reinterpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document culminated in a famous incident on July 4th, 1854, in Framingham, Massachusetts. During his speech, Garrison pulled out of his pocket a copy of the Constitution, which he called a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and set it aflame. These two founding documents were seen by both sides as fundamentally different and in direct opposition to one another. The Radical Declaration, with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, and the Constitution, which established and maintained law and order and slavery. And so abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document, and hence which principles, defined the revolution, and by extension, the nation. In some sense, those who opposed slavery's spread hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while Southern Democrats hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. By the time of Lincoln's election and the secession that followed, Southerners' relationship to the Revolution had become strained. In 1857, George Fitzhugh, a well-known pro-slavery Southern writer, had argued that, quote, liberty and equality are new things under the sun. In other words, those principles had not been a part of the Revolution. Instead, they were new Northern principles that he blamed for Northern problems like crime, immigration, and moral decay. Increasingly, Southerners came to see Jeffersonian democracy as having made abolition possible because of the possibility of the tyranny of the majority. Slavery, they thought, was under threat because Washington, Adams, and Hamilton had failed to limit the democratic principles of the Jeffersonians. Jefferson was described as a, quote, fanatical political monomaniac who was, quote, the father of all the calamities that are now being visited upon the nation. They described the Declaration as, quote, an instrument more properly expressive of the passionate and delirious ravings of a Parisian mob than the calm, dignified utterance of a nation. And at the same time, a number of well-known Southern writers also began to reinterpret the Constitution. They claimed that the founders never intended that the union of the Constitution to be perpetual. They argued that the founders always intended to allow states to leave whenever they saw fit. Arguments like these were highly charged. They were as emotional as they were intellectual. And that's because that was necessary, really, to try to convince their fellow Southerners to break their emotional connection to the Revolution. And ultimately, to establish a new nation, Southerners had to reimagine the origin myth of the United States in a way that would justify the creation of their own nation, and then serve as the basis of their own origin myth. Now, this is one of many examples of partisan conflicts over the memory of the Revolution that I detail in my book. But I also want to give you a quick sense of just how far across the political spectrum the memory of the Revolution has been used, from the far left to the far right. In the 1930s, as part of its Popular Front strategy, the Communist Party of the United States used the founders and the memory of the Revolution to redefine itself and its agenda as an extension of the nation's revolutionary ideals and heritage. They adopted the slogan, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century," and combined that with the famous Spirit of 76 image. The CPUSA found great value in reminding Americans that, quote, this country won its independence in a great liberating revolutionary struggle. And as a group who wanted to see the end of economic classes, they adopted the Declaration as a radical expression of equality. The Communist Party continues the traditions of 1776, they claimed. And it's during this Popular Front period in the late 1930s and early 40s that the Communist Party of the US enjoyed its widest following. At the same time, on the far right, the German-American Bund was an American pro-Nazi group led by German immigrants who were also using the memory of the Revolution to aid in its cause of anti-Semitism and isolationism. The Bund's goal was to win American popular support for isolationism and oppose American intervention into the coming war. Washington was a popular symbol for the Bund because of his farewell address, right, which famously called on future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. On the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-America rally at the old Madison Square Garden to commemorate Washington's birthday. More than 15,000 people attended this rally, where the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington flanked by 1776 flags and swastikas. The speakers warned that as more Americans favored entering World War II, quote, "We are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington." The Bund used the memory of Washington and the memory of the Revolution for this purpose of isolationism, but also because they knew its emotional power and that could aid them in helping them to appeal to native-born Americans who are wary of foreign organizations like this. And ultimately, the Bund tried to convince Americans that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution. And a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. So between these two examples, I want to give you a sense of just, how wide across the political spectrum the memory of the Revolution has been used fairly successfully. And part of this is because of that unusual emotional connection, but also because that also generates a sort of power of legitimacy to the memory of the Revolution. It's not just partisan division, though, that can change the memory of the Revolution or cause political conflicts to arise. And so I want to give you one last story. This is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. After the success of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, he became convinced that a similar large-scale historical epic about the Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film ever made about the American Revolution. He was going to write, produce, and direct it himself, even though he had no prior experience with any of that. His film, The Spirit of 76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the U.S. had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the Revolution. But of course, relations between the two countries had become more friendly around the turn of the century. In attendance at this pre-screening in Chicago were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board, which was headed by this man, Major Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser. The critics described the film as patriotic. Funkhauser disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities, including a British soldier ransacking an American house and sticking his bayonet through a supposedly occupied baby's crib. There was another scene that showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. Funkhauser said that these scenes would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of our allies in the present war. So Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show it as long as he deleted those offending scenes. And we don't know why, but before the film premiered proper in Los Angeles in November of that year, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. He was arrested immediately and charged under the Espionage Act, which had passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. Bail was set at $10,000. The LA Daily Times ran the headline, "War of Revolution Film Seized by Government." The case went to trial and it was presided over by I kid you not, Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The media reported unfounded rumors that Goldstein was a German agent and that the film was German propaganda. Goldstein was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. He was released from prison early in 1921 because of a review of prosecutions under the Espionage Act. But after an unsuccessful effort to revive the film, he essentially left the U.S. To go to Europe to look for work. He last turns up in 1935 in Berlin, where he is arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. Now, this story is an example of how the politics of the times can shape the ways we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film that was loosely based on the memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. His story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we are young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and newer memories of the revolution emerge to challenge or replace it. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If he had released the film a few years earlier or a few years later, things would have likely turned out very different. Instead, Goldstein was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of 76 has ever been found. And so this is just one example of how foreign affairs can have an impact on the memory of the revolution. And in my book, I also explore how the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and its end in the 1980s also caused significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. To conclude, I want to argue that the revolution matters most in the present, not so much because it happened, but because we remember it. Though the founders created the nation state itself, so much of the original governments and politics that they envisioned and created no longer exist. The federal constitution and the state constitutions that they created have been amended and, in the latter's case, rewritten many times. In many ways, we have been living under a government of which just the barest bones of the structure was actually created by the revolution and the founders. Indeed, many founders claimed that the revolution had already been corrupted, betrayed, or mangled beyond recognition in their own lifetimes, not least by democracy. We simply no longer understand politics or society in the ways that the founders did. So I would argue that the revolution has mattered primarily because we remember it and because of the unique role that that memory plays in our politics and culture. The memory of the revolution has served, most importantly, I think, as a vehicle of expression, as a sort of shared political language through which Americans define not only the past, but the present and the future. And though the memory of the revolution may seem to have done more to divide Americans than unite them, I would argue that fighting over its meaning reveals a sort of underlying shared perception about the importance of the revolution as our national origin story. And it also serves as an expression of the kind of civic engagement that is needed to maintain a democratic republic. So in this talk, I've tried to explore what it means that we mythologize the revolution, to show a little bit of how that has actually worked and how it has played out in the practice of American politics. And at the heart of it is the importance of how we tell the story. If readers should take anything away from this book, it should be a greater awareness of that importance. How we tell the story of the revolution matters, whether it's an unqualified triumph, a hypocritical failure, or somewhere in between. I've tried to show that how we have told the story has fostered an unusual emotional connection between Americans and their revolution as a way of helping to understand its unique role in our culture. And because the purpose of the origin myth is to define and justify first principles and political agendas, conflicts over different memories of the revolution have been constant throughout American history. And that is because the revolution is this shared political language that allows it to be a tool for communicating across the many divides inherent in such a diverse nation and polity. Ultimately, the memory of the revolution has been an important way that Americans express their political beliefs in the present and their visions of the future. It has long been part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. And each new generation has produced multiple new memories of the revolution, often in direct conflict with one another. As a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. The memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you. We have time for questions, Stephen?
I will ask the audience to hold the questions until you have a microphone in your hand, please.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I noticed you didn't cover the present period. Would you like to comment on how
You think
we're
I'm
using this
crazy?
today?
The book goes up to 2001, which is close enough, I think. Though the epilogue does go a little bit beyond that. You know what I would say about, I would say that one of the things that I learned about how we fight over the revolution today is that there's very little that's new in it, right? A lot of the sort of controversies that we've had in the last 10 or 15 years or so, controversies over textbooks and things like that. My book shows examples of that happening in the 1920s. So there's not a lot that's new. And I think that's actually important because it's politically advantageous to depict new memories of the revolution. And this is a consistent theme throughout the 20th century in my book, to depict new memories of the revolution as a sort of unprecedented threat, right, to the national character or to our education system. And when you think that, you know, everything is a new and unprecedented threat, that's not good for our politics. And so I think, you know, if you read this book, I suspect that, you know, that you will find almost nothing new in how we fight about the revolution today. And in fact, even how we talk about the revolution today. One of the things my book shows is that how many conservatives remember the revolution is basically a memory that came out of the Cold War in the 1950s. And that the ways that many liberals see the revolution is rooted in the sort of long bicentennial era on the back of the civil rights movement. So even the ways that we talk about the revolution, let alone fight over it, today are not very new.
Would you, and I have not read your book, so it may be there or may not be there, but would you comment on the transition of power from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, which was, to me, very consequential in American, quote, democracy, where opposing parties opposing individuals. It was a peaceful transfer of power. And what in the revolution made that possible?
The second one is a huge question. The first one seems like more a question for the library's director than myself, who has just written a book on that topic. What I would say, I'll say something about the memory of that event, though, which is the peaceful transfer of power that happens between Federalists and Republicans in after the election of 1800. First of all, it was not especially peaceful. States were raising militias in case the outcome of that balloting in the House turned out in ways that they didn't want. But I'll say that the depiction of it and the way that we remember it in that way that you're describing has not been a sort of constant feature of the memory of the revolution. It only becomes it only takes any significant part in the memory of the revolution when there is a sense that the peaceful transfer of power is threatened. So if the peaceful transfer of power in times when that seems, where there seems a possibility that that is, that there's a possibility that that might not happen, that event takes on greater significance, right? If I was giving this talk 20 years ago, I would not expect to get that question, is my point. So, yeah.
Since you've agreed to cover current news, I'm sure this wouldn't be easier. In the pantheon of documents, I would put the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln and a reimagining of the Declaration and his own view on unity in particular. So I'm interested in what you think about Lincoln and how he shapes that story.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people tend to think about the Gettysburg Address in the sort of the way that Gary Wills has written about it. Is Gary Wills says that, you know, Lincoln redefined the revolution, the revolutionary ideals or first principles of liberty and equality, right? And Gary Wills says that after that we were changed as a nation, right? That's a little grandiose, I think. Like I pointed out earlier, there's never been consensus about what those two terms mean, right? Or how they should be applied. And I actually think that the significance of the Gettysburg Address is not that it created consensus, but in some sense, he created the foundation unwittingly for one of the main ways that Americans would fight over the meaning of the revolution for most of the 20th century, right? Which is, it's not until, you know, the late 19th or early 20th century that people come to understand the liberty of the Declaration as the liberty of the individual. And the idea has been, for most of the 20th century, there's been a constant thread of people who understand the liberty of the Declaration as being individual liberty, also seeing any attempts to redress inequalities as infringements of their individual liberty. And that is, I mean, there's an argument that goes back to Bacon's Rebellion. You could take it that far back. But it's certainly an important part of how, especially conservatives in the 20th century, have understood liberty. And so in some sense, Lincoln is talking about liberty and equality in the ways that abolitionists did, as these two mutually reinforcing principles, right? But he could not have known that with the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, and then the subsequent developments of the Gilded Age, that those two ideas would no longer be seen as mutually reinforcing, but would be seen as in conflict with one another.
Thank you. How were the deaths of Madison and Jefferson and the final members present at the Constitutional Convention? How did that affect the cycle of mythologizing of the American founding when the last ones died?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Obviously, we all know the story of Adams and Jefferson, right? And I have a chapter on that and the Jubilee of 1826 in the book. And that's a profound event, partly because there was already a recognition that the revolutionary generation was dying out. And then here you have these two sort of, what at the time they called two authors of the Declaration, or authors of independence. And in many speeches, I went back through a lot of orations and newspaper reporting around that. It's their deaths are reported as a providential event, like I talked about earlier in the talk. Their simultaneous deaths lent a sort of a providential stamp of approval to the memory of the revolution, and in some sense to the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Constitutional Convention is a little bit different. Typically, when people say signers, they're referring to the people who signed the Declaration, not the people who signed the Constitution. But Madison's notes only came out in 1840 because he refused to publish them while he was still alive. And so he made an agreement that his notes could be published posthumously. So in a sense, this new knowledge about what had happened at the convention, how this Constitution that so many people revered had actually come to be, in some sense required Madison to pass on. So there is this, in the 1840s and 50s, there is an even more intense fascination with Revolutionary War veterans who are still alive. There are no signers of the Declaration left after, I want to say, the early 1830s. But so it's actually the Continental Army veterans who became, the remaining public face of the actual revolution, not the signers of the Constitution. And there's a famous book that was published in 1865 called "The Last Men of the Revolution," which has daguerreotype images of these, I think it was 6 or 7 living veterans of the revolution of the Continental Army, who were all in their hundreds. And it was a fascinating thing that was reported on because an audit of the federal government turned up that these men still existed and were collecting pensions. And so it became a sort of national story.
So my question, first of all, thank you, great talk. Memory and technology. On one side, we have the internet that gives anyone access to the historical papers, original documents. On the other side, we have search engines, which can promote or suppress. And in the middle, we got this new thing called AI, which personally scares the hell out of me. But I was wondering, from your viewpoint and the research you've done, what do you think the future is of our memory?
I am a historian. I cannot predict the future. But I mean, the new technologies have been a part of the memory of the revolution, from the beginning in some sense, but especially in the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries. Part of the reason that Goldstein is trying to create that film in the 19-teens is not just because he wants to make a lot of money, even though that's probably the primary reason. It's also that there's a sense of, you have this new medium of film, right? And it's still silent film. And there's a sense that he is sort of modernizing the memory of the revolution, right? For this new 20th century. And there's other ways that manifests itself in the politics and culture of the 1910s that I talk about in the book. As for the present, I mean, I think there was a radical thing happened in the 1950s regarding the study of the revolution, which was the creation of the transferring of revolutionary era primary sources to microfilm. And that made it so that college students all across the country could have access to these documents, which was not the case before. It's why so much of the scholarship about the revolution before 1950 comes out of Northeastern Ivy League universities, right? Once the microfilm started to spread in the 1950s and 1960s, we start seeing, in terms of the historiography, we start seeing prominent new scholars making very different arguments about the revolution from Wisconsin or Kansas or places like that in the Midwest, right? Now that's about the study of the revolution, not necessarily the popular memory of it. But I suspect that the growing digitization of revolutionary era documents and primary sources, I think it's going to have a sort of similar effect on historians more than the public. How many of you know someone personally who spends a lot of time reading 18th century manuscripts that have been digitized? Okay, yeah. You guys don't count, and you know it.
I am a historian, so I am going to ask you a question. And it is going to be about history and the 18th century. When you talk about memory making and the American Revolution, I think you and I could agree it starts during the Revolution.
Yeah.
Right? I'm writing about Benedict Arnold and Peggy Arnold, and there's certainly already a mythology being built around them and good versus evil. So where do you want to start this?
Yeah.
Where do you want to start the memory making?
So that's a great question. Obviously, for the purposes of this book, I started in the 1790s, but there could have easily been a chapter previous to that in the things that you're talking about. My first book is, in some sense, I don't want to say this is a sequel to that book, but it also, my first book also sort of focuses more on how immediately after the revolution ended, or the war ended, there was a more of a focus on the history of the colonial past than the revolutionary past, because it was so recent, right? And there was a desire to give this new nation a sense of a deeper past, right? So in some sense, but you're right, that events are being mythologized, in some sense mythologized, almost really in real time, right? I mean, Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre is the most, obvious example of that. But I think a lot of general readers typically aren't aware of just how many visual sources are available from that time and the outsized impact that they could have on public opinion, political cartoons and things like that. So, if I was to do a preceding chapter to chapter 1, it could be something like that.
Any more questions? I want to thank everyone for being such a great audience tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Give a big round
Thank
of
you for
applause.
coming.
We've got plenty of copies of the book for sale out in the hall, and Dr. Hattem will be here signing books in the front of the room.